Hello and welcome to Econ and Decon. I appreciate you joining me. Today we're going to do a little bonus video on inflation. Now, if you haven't already seen our three-part series on inflation, I suggest you go check them out now. There should be a link right here, or maybe right here or something. I don't know. You're the one looking at it. Just click it. But today we're going to be talking about a narrative that is floating around everywhere. This narrative that corporate greed is really what's driving inflation. Now, you hear Elizabeth Warren talking about this a lot.
We're not fooled. These giant corporations are inflating their profits and leaving us with the crumbs, literally.
You also hear my favorite professor, Richard Wolff, talk about this.
Here's what corporations want to do. They want to make up, and they want to do it quickly. And the quickest way to make more profits, and this is basic economics, is to jack up the price. And that's what they're doing.
And they're not alone. This take is everywhere. I mean, just reach for your nearest, dumbest politician or pundit, and you'll hear somebody say this. But this should give you pause immediately. I mean, where was all this greed in the 90s? Did greed not exist in the early 2000s or after 2008? Was greed not around in 2018? I mean, blaming inflation on greed is like blaming a plane crash on gravity. I mean, okay, it exists, but what else happened? I mean, why don't all those other planes crash? Why doesn't every plane that takes off end up crashing? Well, for one, Joe Biden doesn't pilot them.
All men and women created by go, you know the thing.
But for two, the plane has all of these little pieces that are meant to counteract gravity. Well, similarly, the market, the economy has a lot of little pieces in place, competitive forces that make it impossible for greed to take over. Otherwise, it would take over all the time. So what was different after 2020? The first and most obvious thing that was different was that people were given a tremendous amount of money. The government printed a ton of money, and actually most of it, they didn't even give it to people. They gave it to banks and corporations. All of these people, banks, corporations, are sitting on a huge amount of money, but where are they going to spend it? You see, so many companies were shut down. How many small businesses and mom and pop shops do you know that were labeled non-essential and were shut down? But Walmart didn't close, and Amazon didn't close down. But add to this that most imports were shut down, and what you have is a bunch of people with a bunch of newly created money in their pockets who have a very limited number of options to spend that money with. Especially when you talk about imports being shut down. I mean, we're a consumer-based economy. We don't make things. We buy things from other people. So you have all of this money and a very few large connected corporations that are still open and left to funnel all of this money into. If you were trying to design a situation in which greed could take advantage, you're off to a pretty good start. So only the largest, most well-connected multinational companies are left open, and now everybody in the country, including banks and other corporations, have all of this newly created money in their pocket and only these few options to spend it on. If you were in power in 2020 and your goal was to transfer as much wealth as possible from the poor and the working class to these multinational corporations, you could not have done it better. You could not have done that better if you tried. So all of that to say that greed was encouraged, greed was incentivized. The competitive forces that stop corporations from being greedy all the time were pulled out from under the economy. But this video is not about that. This video is not about absolving corporations of their greed and pointing the finger at the government and saying that it's really their fault. This video is about the fact that corporate greed, despite everything that I just said, is not what drove the inflation. And here's how we know. There are three major factors we're going to look at that show that this narrative is false, that corporate greed is not what drove the inflation. The first of these three factors is the money supply. Now, if you remember our first inflation video, we talked about M as the money supply, and we talked about how 40% of all dollars in existence right now in the U.S. were actually created in 2020. But it's actually a little bit worse than that. You see, M, as we talked about in the Inflation Part 1 video, there's actually different levels to this. So the most basic money in the economy is called M1. This is basically just cash and checking account deposits that exist. M2 is the next level up of money. This includes things like savings accounts and credit that's floating around the system because that's usable money. When I talked about 40%, that's M2. 40% of all M2 in the economy was created just since 2020. Now, that's an incredible number, but M1 is the real base money, deposits at banks and just cash in the system. That went from $1.5 trillion to $6 trillion in just over a year. That is an unfathomable number. So the most base measure of money in the economy quadrupled in just over a year. Corporations can't do that. I don't need to recap the last videos for you to understand how do you increase the base money supply? How do you quadruple the base money supply and expect that not to filter out through the economy and result in higher prices? You don't, unless you're an idiot, which we've already covered. Moving on. The next argument that blows this narrative apart has to do with the CPI versus the PPI. Now, as we talked about in the last few videos, the CPI is the Consumer Price Index. This is the government measure of how much prices are changing month over month and year over year. We're going to talk about 2022 because 2022 was the year of the worst inflation during the pandemic. The CPI recorded a value of 8%, 8% inflation during the year 2022. But what most people don't realize is there is also something called the PPI. This is the Producer Price Index. So this is essentially the price that the grocery store pays for its inputs. This is the price that manufacturing companies pay for their commodity inputs. Now, a commodity is just an input to make another good. So think about aluminum. Aluminum can be used to make cars. It can be used to make tinfoil. Hell, it can be used to make great hats. Okay, but aluminum is a commodity. A producer buys that and then turns it into something and then sells it to you. There is a price index for producers. And in 2022, it went up 16%. Now, if you're keeping score at home, check my math, but I'm pretty sure that's about double the CPI. 8% CPI, 16% PPI. So according to the government's numbers, producer prices actually went up faster than consumer prices. Now, before you turn off your TV or jump out of your chair, I am not sitting here saying that corporations were sitting here taking the arrows for the rest of us. Okay, I'm not saying that they were absorbing all of that inflation. If you watched the last video, you know that I think the CPI is understated by about half. I think the real inflation rate is probably about double the stated inflation rate. But even if you double that 8% number, you land right on the PPI number. So according to the government's own numbers, corporations' prices for their inputs went up faster than their sale prices did. Make that make sense. How can the government say that this is all corporate greed when their numbers show that corporations didn't keep up? The last thing we're going to talk about that'll bring this point home is big picture. This is GDP increase versus corporate profits increase. So you see, as we talked about, the GDP is the national income. This is the gross domestic product. It's just essentially how much money was made in America in a given year. So what you would expect if all of the inflation was driven by corporate greed is for the increase in corporate profits to resemble closely or match up very well with the increase in GDP that was attributable to inflation. The way you do that is like this. You look at the GDP in 2021, and then you look at the inflation number from 2022, that 8%. So you say, okay, the gross domestic product of America went up 8% just from inflation before there was any growth. Just 8% from inflation. So when you look at 8% of the 2021 GDP, what you get is $1.86 trillion. So according to the government, inflation was responsible for $1.86 trillion extra changing hands in the economy. Corporate profits, on the other hand, went up $136 billion. If you don't have a calculator handy, that means corporate profits went up less than 1/13 of the increase in GDP attributable to inflation. So corporate profits accounted for less than 1/13 of the increase in money changing hands. But I actually think that's overstating it. Because you see, this $1.86 trillion number comes from the 8% CPI number. I actually think, as I mentioned in the last video, that CPI number is understated. I think there was more inflation. I think more increase in GDP resulted directly from inflation. So that number, in my mind, should be bigger. But then when you look at the corporate profit number, in 2021, corporate profits were somewhere around $3.2 trillion a year. Do the math on that. An increase of $136 billion is 4% increase. And by the way, that's not inflation adjusted. That's just a bulk number. So the increase in corporate profits did not even keep up with the published inflation rate. This is another government number that shows corporations didn't even keep up in 2022. So explain to me how a 4% increase in corporate profits that amounted to $136 billion, how was that the driver for an 8% published inflation rate that caused $1.86 trillion of new exchange in the economy? It doesn't make any sense. According to the government's own numbers, corporations didn't even keep up with inflation. Stop listening to these people. Again, as we talked about in the first video, you have to find good sources. You have to find people who are not lying to you. You need to curate a list of sources of people that you know, at the very least, even if they're wrong, they're not being dishonest. Go back to your sources. Who have you heard say this? Who have you heard spin this narrative of this is all just caused by corporate greed? And then stop listening to those people. That's about all I got for you today. I appreciate you stopping by. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed yourself. Most importantly, if you see Michael Moore in the streets, just punch him in the nuts and tell him he's an idiot. And if you'd like to support the channel, head on over to antitanktops.com. We got a lot of good provocative swag over there. This shirt is actually not one of mine, but boy, do I love it. Thanks again for stopping by. This is Econ and Decon signing out. Peace.